World War II gave Hollywood endless material, but some filmmakers went too far. These movies showed the war without sanitizing the violence, the atrocities, or the moral collapse. Europe banned them, censored them, or tried to bury them completely. These are 8 World War II films so graphic they couldn't handle the truth. Number 8. Cross of Iron.
As the once invincible.
Sam Peckinpah took his ultra-violent style to the Eastern Front in 1977, and multiple European countries immediately started cutting footage or banning it outright. The film follows a German platoon during the Soviet offensive of 1943, and Peckinpah didn't soften anything about the brutality of that campaign. This wasn't Hollywood Nazis getting what they deserved. This was German soldiers being ground into meat by the Soviet war machine, and European censors lost their minds. The film stars James Coburn as Sergeant Steiner, a working-class soldier who's been fighting since the invasion of Russia and has watched the war destroy everything. He's cynical, exhausted, and disgusted by officers like Captain Stransky, played by Maximilian Schell, who've arrived late to the war looking for glory. The conflict between Steiner's pragmatic survival and Stransky's aristocratic delusion drives the plot, but Peckinpah cares more about showing what the Eastern Front actually looked like. What got Cross of Iron banned or heavily censored across Europe was Peckinpah's refusal to make the violence heroic or even comprehensible. The combat sequences are chaotic. Bodies explode, men scream, tanks crush soldiers into the mud. Peckinpah used slow motion extensively, not to make violence beautiful, but to force viewers to see every detail of what bullets and shrapnel do to human bodies. West Germany cut over 20 minutes from the film. The UK censored multiple sequences. France banned it outright initially, arguing it glorified Wehrmacht soldiers. The opening montage, which intersperses newsreel footage of Hitler and Nazi rallies with combat footage and children playing with weapons, immediately establishes the film's thesis. War destroyed innocence and turned an entire generation into colors. Peckinpah doesn't judge the German soldiers for fighting. He shows them as professionals doing a horrific job in service of monstrous leadership. That nuanced portrayal made European censors uncomfortable because it humanized Wehrmacht soldiers at a time when the official narrative was still treating all German soldiers as willing participants in genocide. The film's depiction of Soviet forces was equally controversial. Peckinpah shows them as brutal and relentless, using human wave attacks that sacrifice thousands to take objectives. The scene where German machine gunners mow down waves of Soviet infantry advancing across open ground is genuinely harrowing, because Peckinpah shoots it without romance or heroism. It's just industrial-scale culling, and both sides are participating in mechanized slaughter. James Coburn's performance as Steiner is one of the great anti-hero turns in war cinema. Steiner isn't noble or particularly moral. He's just smart enough to understand the war is lost, and Germany deserves to lose it. He protects his men not out of patriotic duty, but because they're all he has left. When Stransky demands Steiner lie and say Stransky led an assault he actually fled from, Steiner's contempt is palpable. The aristocratic officer class started this war and abandoned the working-class soldiers to die in it. The film's climax, where Steiner's platoon gets cut off behind Soviet lines and has to fight their way back, is pure Peckinpah carnage. The violence is exhausting and relentless. Men die randomly and pointlessly. The survivors make it back to German lines only to discover their position is being overrun anyway. Everything they endured was for nothing. That nihilistic conclusion, combined with the final freeze frame of Steiner laughing hysterically at the futility of everything, made Cross of Iron too dark for European audiences still processing the war's trauma. Peckinpah shot the film in Yugoslavia with Yugoslav army cooperation, using real tanks and thousands of extras. The production was chaotic, with Peckinpah drinking heavily and feuding with producers. But the authenticity of the military equipment and the scale of the battle sequences gave everything a documentary quality that made the violence feel more real than typical war films. European censors recognized this wasn't a Hollywood fantasy. This was a serious attempt to show the Eastern Front's reality. and that reality was too disturbing to show uncensored. The film's treatment in Europe varied by country. West Germany cut it heavily, removing the most graphic violence and toning down the criticism of the German officer corps. The UK initially gave it an X rating and demanded cuts before allowing wider release. France banned it for 2 years before allowing a censored version. The Soviet Union banned it completely, unsurprisingly, given its portrayal of Red Army tactics. Cross of Iron didn't fit anyone's comfortable narrative about the war, and so everyone tried to bury or sanitize it. Number 7. Come and See. Ilsa Klimov's 1985 Soviet masterpiece about the Nazi occupation of Belarus is the most disturbing WWII film ever made. And while it wasn't banned in Western Europe, several countries restricted it to very limited release because censors couldn't figure out how to rate something this traumatic. The film follows a teenage boy who joins Soviet partisans and over the course of a few days witnesses atrocities that destroy his sanity and innocence. It's not entertainment, it's an endurance test that leaves viewers genuinely traumatized. The film opens with Flyora, played by Alexei Kravchenko, as an enthusiastic boy digging for rifles in the sand to join the partisans. He's excited about war, seeing it as adventure and glory. Within the first hour, German forces massacre his village while he's away. He returns to find everyone dead, and his face begins the transformation that continues throughout the film. By the ending, Kravchenko looks decades older, his face aged by horror into something barely human. What makes Come and See unbearable is Klimov's commitment to subjective experience. The sound design puts you inside Flyora's head as his hearing gets damaged by explosions. Voices become muffled. Ringing tinnitus drowns out dialogue. The world becomes hostile and incomprehensible. Klimov uses long takes and Steadicam shots that follow Flyora through nightmares he can't escape. You're trapped with him, experiencing his psychological disintegration in real time. The village massacre sequence is where the film crosses into territory most World War II movies won't touch. Klimov doesn't cut away or imply violence. He shows German soldiers herding civilians into a church and burning them alive. You hear the screaming. You see people trying to escape through windows and getting shot. The sequence goes on forever, refusing to let the audience escape or look away. European censors struggled with this because it wasn't exploitative or gratuitous. It was just honest about what happened in Belarus, where the Nazis murdered a quarter of the population. Klimov based the film on extensive research into Nazi atrocities in Belarus, including testimony from survivors. The burning church scene was based on the Cotton Massacre, where 149 people were killed. The film's final title card states that 628 Belarusian villages were burned with their inhabitants during the occupation. Come and See isn't exaggerating or sensationalizing. If anything, Klimov was showing restraint by focusing on one boy's experience rather than attempting to portray the full scale of the genocide. The film's approach to showing Nazi soldiers is what made some European countries uncomfortable with wide release. Klimov doesn't make cartoons or psychopaths, they're just men doing a job, which makes their evil more disturbing. There's a scene where German soldiers are joking and laughing while burning people alive in the church, and that casual cruelty is more horrifying than any amount of dramatic villainy. The film shows how ordinary people become capable of monstrous acts when ideology dehumanizes their victims. Alexei Kravchenko's performance is one of the most remarkable in cinema. He was 14 when filming started, and Klimov put him through genuinely traumatic experiences to capture authentic reactions. The mud sequences where Flyora and a girl struggle through a swamp were shot with real bullets fired over the actors' heads. The physical toll on Kravchenko is visible throughout the film. His transformation from innocent boy to traumatized survivor isn't acting. It's documentation of what the production did to him. The ending, where Flyora shoots at a portrait of Hitler while archival footage of Hitler's rise plays in reverse, is Klimov's attempt to imagine preventing the war. But even that fantasy offers no comfort because the destruction has already happened. Flyora can't undo what he's experienced. The film's Russian title translates to Go and See, a reference to Revelation's 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Klimov is commanding viewers to witness what war actually does to people, particularly children. Come and See received limited theatrical release in Western Europe despite critical acclaim because distributors didn't know how to market something this devastating. It's not a war film in any traditional sense. It's closer to horror, except the horror is historical and documented. The UK gave it a limited art house release. France showed it at festivals but barely released it theatrically. West Germany was particularly reluctant to distribute a film showing Wehrmacht atrocities in such unflinching detail. The film found its audience primarily through film societies and repertory screenings, rather than mainstream distribution. Number 6. Men Behind the Sun. T.F. Mo's 1988 Hong Kong film about Japanese Unit 731's biological warfare experiments in Manchuria is the most notorious WWII film ever made, and it's banned outright in multiple European countries to this day. The film depicts the Japanese Army's human experimentation program with graphic detail that crosses every line of taste and decency. European censors didn't debate whether to cut it, they just banned it completely and moved on. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research program run by the Imperial Japanese Army during World War II. They conducted experiments on living prisoners, mostly Chinese civilians and Allied POWs, testing weapons and studying disease progression. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 3,000, though it may have been significantly higher. After the war, the United States granted immunity to Unit 731 researchers in exchange for their data, and Japan has never fully acknowledged the program's crimes. Men Behind the Sun was the first major film to depict these atrocities, and it did so with documentary-like brutality. The film follows a group of young Japanese soldiers assigned to Unit 731 who gradually realize they're participating in monstrous crimes. Mo structures it almost like a war film initially, with the soldiers arriving at the facility and being indoctrinated into treating prisoners as logs rather than humans. The dehumanization happens systematically, and Mo shows how ordinary soldiers became complicit in genocide through bureaucracy and propaganda. What got Men Behind the Sun banned across Europe was the graphic depiction of experiments. There's a sequence showing frostbite experiments where prisoners' arms are frozen and then thawed, showing the tissue damage in clinical detail. Another shows a prisoner being placed in a pressure chamber until his intestines explode out of his body. The film doesn't cut away or soften anything. Mao claimed he wanted to document these crimes so they couldn't be denied or forgotten, but the result is almost unwatchable. The most controversial element was Mo's claim that he used actual autopsy footage in some sequences. Whether this is true remains disputed, but the rumor was enough to get the film banned in the UK, Germany, and several other countries before anyone even watched it. The British Board of Film Classification refused to rate it, effectively banning it from legal release. Germany banned it as violating laws against depicting extreme violence. France allowed a heavily censored version but banned the uncut film. The film's defenders argue it's an important historical document that exposes Japanese war crimes that have been systematically covered up. Unit 731's atrocities are less well known in the West than Nazi concentration camps, partly because the US helped suppress information in exchange for research data. Men Behind the Sun, despite its exploitation elements, brought attention to crimes that Japan still hasn't fully acknowledged. The film sparked protests in Japan and led to renewed calls for the government to admit what happened. Critics argue the film is exploitation hiding behind historical importance. The graphic violence serves no educational purpose beyond shock value. Mu lingers on suffering in ways that feel voyeuristic rather than respectful to victims. The line between documenting atrocities and exploiting them for entertainment is difficult to define, and Men Behind the Sun doesn't help its case by including the autopsy footage controversy and animal cruelty in the form of a cat being genuinely fed to rats on camera. The film spawned multiple sequels, each more exploitative than the last, which undermined any claim that the original had educational value. Men Behind the Sun. 2 and subsequent films dropped any pretense of historical documentation and became straight torture porn. This retroactively damaged the first film's reputation, making it easier for censors to dismiss the entire series as exploitation rather than education. European countries that banned Men Behind the Sun haven't revisited the decision. The film remains officially banned in the UK, Germany, and Australia. It circulates through underground copies and unregulated streaming, but no legitimate distributor will touch it. Whether this constitutes censorship of important historical documentation or appropriate restriction of exploitative violence remains debated, but for censors, the graphic content made it an easy decision. Number 5. Kapo. Gillo Pontecorvo's 1960 Italian-French-Yugoslav co-production about concentration camps was banned in Israel and heavily censored across Europe for its sympathetic portrayal of a Kapo, a prisoner who collaborated with Nazis in exchange for better treatment. The film follows a Jewish girl who survives by becoming a Kapo and brutalizing other prisoners, and European audiences were not ready for a film that humanized collaboration. The film stars Susan Strasberg as Edith, a French-Jewish teenager deported to Auschwitz. To survive, she assumes the identity of a dead political prisoner and eventually becomes a Kapo, a prisoner given authority over other prisoners. The film shows her transformation from victim to perpetrator, how survival in the camps required moral compromise, and how the Nazi system turned prisoners against each other. That uncomfortable examination of how victims became complicit in their own oppression was too much for early 1960s audiences. What got Kapo banned or censored across Europe was its refusal to present camp prisoners as purely heroic victims. Edith brutalizes other prisoners to maintain her position. She informs on escape attempts to protect herself. She develops a relationship with an SS officer. Pontecorvo doesn't judge her for these choices. He shows them as rational responses to impossible circumstances. But European audiences and censors wanted clear moral lines. The idea that Jewish prisoners could become complicit in Nazi crimes even under duress was unacceptable. The film was particularly controversial in Israel, where it was banned outright. Israeli censors argued it defamed Holocaust victims by suggesting they collaborated with Nazis. Survivors objected to the portrayal of Kapos without sufficient context about the impossible choices they faced. The film seemed to blame victims for their own oppression rather than focusing entirely on Nazi crimes. Pontecorvo tried to argue he was showing the complexity of survival under genocide, but Israel wasn't interested in complexity in 1960. France, which co-produced the film, still censored it heavily. Sequences showing prisoners' brutality toward each other were cut. The romance between Edith and the SS officer was trimmed to minimize any suggestion of genuine feeling. The final cut French audiences saw was significantly shorter and less morally ambiguous than Pontecorvo's original vision. The censorship neutered the film's thesis, turning it into a more conventional narrative about resistance and survival. West Germany banned the film initially, though this was less about the content and more about the political impossibility of distributing a Holocaust film in 1960 West Germany. The country was still processing its collective guilt, and a film showing German soldiers running concentration camps wasn't something distributors wanted to touch. Even films clearly condemning Nazi crimes were difficult to show because they reminded Germans of what their parents' generation had done. The film's climax, where Edith sacrifices herself helping other prisoners escape, was meant to show redemption was possible, even for those who'd collaborated. But critics argued this let her off too easily. The film suggested she could atone for brutalizing prisoners by dying heroically, which trivialized the harm she'd done. This debate about whether collaboration could be redeemed or whether it was an unforgivable betrayal continued to make the film controversial for decades. Kapo's legacy is complicated. It brought attention to an aspect of camp life that had been mostly ignored, the prisoner hierarchy and collaboration. But it did so in ways that many survivors found offensive or inaccurate. The film argues Edith had no choice but to become a Kapo, but historical research suggests most Kapos volunteered for the position to gain advantages. Pontecorvo's sympathetic portrayal may have humanized collaboration at the expense of historical accuracy. The film was eventually unbanned in Israel and allowed fuller release in Europe, but by then its moment had passed. More nuanced Holocaust films had explored similar themes with greater sensitivity. Kapo remains a historical curiosity. important for attempting to show moral complexity in concentration camps but compromised by its melodramatic approach and the controversy that surrounded its release. European censorship damaged the film but also protected audiences from a work that many found genuinely offensive in its implications about victim culpability. Number 4. The Night Porter. Liliana Cavani's 1974 Italian film about a sadomasochistic relationship between an SS officer and his former concentration camp prisoner was banned in multiple European countries and sparked riots at screenings. The film stars Dirk Bogarde as Max, a former Nazi officer working as a night porter in Vienna, who encounters Lucia, played by Charlotte Rampling, a woman he tortured and raped in a concentration camp. They resume their relationship, and the film explores their twisted dynamic without judgment or clear moral positioning. What got the Night Porter banned across Europe wasn't just the graphic sexual content. It was the suggestion that Lucia willingly returned to her abuser, that she found something in their dynamic she couldn't escape or didn't want to. The film shows explicit scenes of their camp relationship, including a notorious sequence where Lucia performs topless wearing SS uniform pieces. Cavani claimed she was exploring Stockholm Syndrome and trauma bonding before those terms were widely understood, but critics argued she was romanticizing Nazi abuse. Italy initially tried to ban the film outright. Prosecutors in Rome charged Cavani with obscenity, arguing the film glorified fascism and Nazism by portraying a sympathetic SS officer. The case eventually got dismissed, but the controversy meant many Italian theaters refused to show it. When it did screen, neo-fascist groups protested outside theaters, while anti-fascist groups protested the protesters. The film became a political football nobody wanted to touch. The UK banned it completely. The British Board of Film Classification refused certification, making it illegal to show in cinemas or sell on video. The ban lasted until 1985 when a heavily cut version was finally allowed release. Even then, the BBFC demanded removal of the most explicit sexual content and any suggestion that Lucia was a willing participant in the camp. The censored version neutered Cavani's entire thesis about the psychology of abuse and survival. West Germany predictably banned it. A film showing an SS officer sympathetically was impossible to distribute in the 1970s when Germany was still processing its past. The fact that Max is shown as damaged by his crimes, haunted by what he did, didn't matter. German censors wouldn't allow any humanization of Nazi perpetrators regardless of context. The film remained banned in Germany until the late 1980s. France allowed the film, but with an X rating, restricting it to specialized adult theaters. Even in France, which was typically more liberal about sexual content, The Night Porter was considered too extreme. The combination of explicit SX and Nazi imagery crossed lines that French censors couldn't ignore. The film found an audience in art house theaters but was kept far from mainstream distribution. Charlotte Rampling's performance is what makes the film genuinely disturbing rather than just exploitative. She plays Lucia not as a victim, but as someone whose identity was shattered by camp experiences and rebuilt around her relationship with Max. When they reunite, she's terrified, but also drawn back into familiar patterns. Rampling shows how abuse rewires victims' psychology, making them crave what destroyed them. That uncomfortable truth is what made censors want to bury the film. Dirk Bogarde as Max is equally complex. He's not portrayed as an unrepentant monster. He's a damaged man trying to hide from his past, who gets pulled back into patterns he thought he'd escaped. The film suggests Nazi perpetrators were also traumatized by what they did, which critics found offensive. The idea that SS officers suffered psychological damage from committing atrocities seemed to create false equivalency between perpetrator and victim trauma. The final act, where Max and Lucia barricade themselves in his apartment while his former SS comrades hunt them, attempts to show their love as genuine despite its horrific origin. They starve together rather than separate. The ending where they're culled trying to escape suggests their relationship could only exist in isolation from normal society. Cavani was arguing something complex about how trauma bonds people in ways that transcend morality. but audiences and censors only saw Nazi apologism and sexual exploitation. Number 3. Salon Kitty.
It's a cold and an empty field.
Tinto Brass's 1976 Italian-French-West German Kapo production about an SS brothel used for intelligence gathering is one of the most explicit WWII films ever made, and it was banned or heavily censored across Europe for combining hardcore sexual content with Nazi imagery. The film is based loosely on the real Salon Kitty, a Berlin brothel the SS took over to spy on German military and political figures. But Brass turned historical fact into transgressive exploitation. The plot follows Helmut Wallenberg, an SS officer who takes over Kitty Kellerman's brothel and replaces her prostitutes with women trained to extract secrets from clients. The film shows the training process in graphic detail, including sequences that cross into hardcore pornography. Brass intercuts these sex with Nazi rallies and war footage, creating this queasy juxtaposition of pleasure and genocide. The thesis seems to be that fascism and sexual domination are linked, but mostly it's just exploitation hiding behind political pretension. What got Salon Kitty banned across Europe was the explicit sexual content combined with Nazi uniforms and imagery. Multiple scenes show SS officers engaged in graphic sex acts while in uniform. There's RP, sadomasochism, and sequences depicting sexual humiliation as political control. British censors rejected it immediately, refusing even to consider a cut version. The combination of hardcore sex and Nazi imagery violated laws against obscenity and potentially laws against glorifying fascism. West Germany banned it despite being a co-producer. The film's German backers thought they were funding a serious examination of Nazi sexual politics. What they got was Brass indulging his worst instincts for sexual spectacle and provocation. German censors weren't just concerned about the explicit content. They were horrified by the film's suggestion that Nazi Germany was defined by sexual decadence and perversion. It felt like shifting blame from political ideology to sexual pathology. France, which co-produced alongside Italy and Germany, still censored the film heavily. The version released in France cut over 20 minutes of sexual content, removing anything that crossed into hardcore territory. Even so, it was restricted to X-rated theaters and banned from advertising. French critics savaged it, with one reviewer calling it Nazi pornography masquerading as historical analysis. The film's attempt to be simultaneously erotic and condemnatory satisfied nobody. Italy gave Brass more freedom as the primary production country, but even there the film sparked controversy. Italian prosecutors investigated whether it violated laws against obscenity and Nazi apologism. The case dragged on for years and eventually got dismissed, but the legal cloud meant many Italian distributors refused to handle it. The film found its audience primarily in sex cinemas rather than mainstream theaters, which undermined any claim to serious political intent. The real Salon Kitty operated from 1939 to 1943 and was used by SD intelligence to spy on foreign diplomats and high-ranking Germans. The women working there were pressured or coerced into cooperation, making them victims of Nazi intelligence operations. Brass's film treats this historical reality as backdrop for elaborate sex scenes that have nothing to do with documented facts. The exploitation of real victims' stories for sexual entertainment is what makes Salon Kitty genuinely offensive beyond just the graphic content. The film's politics are muddled at best. Brass seems to be arguing that fascism and sexual repression are linked, that Nazi Germany's public puritanism hid private depravity. But the film spends so much time wallowing in that depravity that any political message gets lost. It feels less like critique and more like Brass using WWII as an excuse to film hardcore sex scenes with production value. Salon Kitty has developed a cult following among extreme cinema fans who appreciate its transgressive combination of sex and history. But it remains banned or unavailable in most European countries. The UK ban has never been lifted. Germany continues to restrict it. France allows only the heavily censored version. The film exists in this gray area between exploitation and art, satisfying neither camp and offending everyone else. Number 2. Ilsa, she-wolf of the SS.
The ultimate in screen terror. The horror that was the Nazi night.
Don Edmonds' 1975 exploitation film about a sadistic concentration camp commandant is banned in multiple European countries and remains one of the most notorious WWII films ever made. Diane Thorne plays Ilsa, a Nazi doctor running a camp where she conducts brutal experiments on prisoners, mostly focusing on sexual torture and endurance testing. The film is pure grindhouse exploitation with no redeeming educational or artistic value, and European censors have consistently refused to allow its release. The plot, such as it is, follows Ilsa conducting experiments to prove women can withstand more pain than men, which she believes will convince the SS to let women fight in combat. She sexually tortures female prisoners, sterilizes them without anesthesia, and murders anyone who fails her experiments. An American POW arrives who can sexually satisfy her, and his apparent immunity to her charms leads to the film's climax. It's trash from start to finish, wallowing in sadistic violence against women under the thinnest veneer of historical context. What got Ilsa banned across Europe was everything. The graphic torture sequences showing electroshock applied to genitals, prisoners being boiled alive, limbs being amputated without anesthesia, the constant nudity and sexual violence that makes up probably 70% of the runtime. The film's fundamental misogyny, treating women's suffering as entertainment. Germany banned it immediately and has never reconsidered. The UK banned it, and that ban remains in effect 50 years later. France banned it not just for obscenity, but for violating laws against trivializing crimes against humanity. Using concentration camps as setting for sadomasochistic exploitation films was seen as profoundly disrespectful to actual victims. French prosecutors argued the film's existence was itself a crime, and while criminal charges were never filed, the ban was absolute. The film cannot be legally shown, sold, or distributed in France. The Netherlands, typically liberal about censorship, still banned Ilsa. Dutch censors argued the film crossed lines that freedom of expression couldn't protect. The combination of graphic violence, sexual torture, and concentration camp setting made it undefendable. Even advocates for free speech struggled to argue Ilsa deserved protection. It was simply too extreme and too offensive. The film was shot on the standing sets from Hogan's Heroes, which had just finished its run. That bizarre trivia makes Ilsa even more tasteless. The same sets used for a lighthearted sitcom about POW camp hijinks became the location for graphic torture porn. The producers saw nothing wrong with this, which tells you everything about their intentions and sensibilities. Diane Thorne became infamous for playing Ilsa across 4 films. She defended the role in interviews, claiming Ilsa was a feminist character because she was powerful and sexual. This strained interpretation fooled no one. Ilsa is a male fantasy of dominant female sexuality, except she's also a Nazi committing atrocities. There's nothing feminist about exploitation films where women's power is expressed through sadistic violence against other women. The film spawned 3 sequels set in different locations, none in concentration camps, but all following the same formula of Ilsa torturing and sexually abusing prisoners. The sequels were banned just as comprehensively as the original. The entire franchise represents the absolute bottom of exploitation cinema, films made by and for people with no ethical boundaries and dubious psychological makeup. Ilsa's continued ban across Europe is one of the few censorship decisions with near-universal support. Even free speech absolutists struggle to defend it. The film has no artistic merit, no educational value, and exists solely to exploit real atrocities for shock value and sexual titillation. European censors refusing to allow its distribution is one of the rare cases where censorship seems justified. Number 1. Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom.
Prendo nota! Certo, care signorine! Visto che vi piace tanto frignare, vi faremo...
Pier Paolo Pasolini's 1975 final film transposed the Marquis de Sade's novel to Mussolini's Italian Social Republic and created the most banned film in European history. Salo depicts 4 fascist libertines who kidnap 18 teenagers and subject them to 4 months of escalating actual torture, humiliation, and eventual murder. The film was banned in multiple countries, sparked violent protests, and remains unwatchable for most viewers even 50 years later. The film is structured around Sayed's novel, divided into circles of perversion, violence, and death. The libertines force their captives to perform degrading sexual acts, eat feces, watch each other being tortured, and eventually get murdered in systematically brutal ways. Pasolini shot everything with cold documentary precision, refusing to make the violence stylized or the suffering theatrical. The result is clinical and unbearable, 2 hours of human degradation without relief or redemption. What separates Salo from exploitation is Pasolini's stated intent to use Sadean imagery to critique fascism and consumer capitalism. He argued modern capitalism reduces humans to consumable objects, just as the libertines reduce their victims to bodies for pleasure and destruction. The film's power structure, where the libertines have absolute control and the victims have none, mirrors both fascist dictatorship and capitalist relations. Whether this political thesis justifies the graphic content is the question that divided critics and censors. Italy banned Salo immediately after Pasolini's murder 2 weeks before the film's premiere. Italian courts ruled it obscene and ordered all prints destroyed. The ban lasted years and became tangled in Italian politics. Pasolini was a communist intellectual, and the right saw the ban as appropriate punishment for degeneracy. The left saw it as fascist censorship of political art. The film became impossible to separate from Italy's political divisions. The UK banned Salo, and the ban lasted over 20 years. The British Board of Film Classification initially refused even to view it for classification. When they finally watched it in the 1990s, they still banned it, arguing no amount of cuts could make it acceptable. The ban was only lifted in 1993, and even then, with an 18 certificate and warnings about extremely disturbing content, the uncut version remained banned until 2000. France, despite being relatively liberal about film content, still struggled with Salo. It was initially banned, then allowed limited release, then rebanned after conservative pressure. The film bounced between legal and illegal status for years depending on political climate. Even when allowed, screenings sparked protests and sometimes violence. Theaters showing it were vandalized. Audience members walked out and demanded refunds while others defended it as essential art. West Germany banned Salo under laws against depictions of violence and sexual abuse. The ban had special weight in Germany, where Pasolini's equation of fascism with sadism touched raw nerves. German intellectuals were divided. Some argued the film was important anti-fascist art. Others believed it trivialized Nazi crimes by filtering them through Sadean fantasy. The debate continued for decades, but the ban remained. The content itself is genuinely unwatchable for most viewers. The feces eating sequence alone has caused countless walkouts. The systematic torture and eventual murders are shot with such cold precision that they feel documentary rather than fictional. Pasolini refused to let viewers escape into fiction. The actors playing victims were mostly non-professionals, teenagers whose discomfort and fear feel absolutely real on camera. Pasolini's murder 2 weeks before the film's release added to its notoriety. He was killed by a teenage hustler in circumstances that remain murky 50 years later. Conspiracy theories claim he was murdered for political reasons, that Salo angered powerful people who arranged his death. Whether true or paranoid speculation, the murder ensured Salo would be remembered as the film someone died making, the work so transgressive it cost its creator his life. Salo remains Pasolini's most controversial work and the most banned film in European history. Its defenders argue it's essential political cinema that uses extreme imagery to force confrontation with fascism's reality. Its detractors call it unwatchable exploitation, hiding behind intellectual pretension. Both sides agree it crosses every line of acceptable content, which is exactly what Pasolini intended. The question is whether that transgression serves any purpose beyond shock. So there you have it. 8 World War II films that showed the war without filters or mercy, and Europe decided audiences couldn't handle the truth. Some deserved their bans, others got censored for daring to show history's darkest chapters honestly. These films remain controversial decades later, proving some wounds never fully heal and some images never stop haunting us.